Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Now, let's start the work of the forum. I don't know whether I should introduce Denise Bombardier, whether I can. For those who've never read anything that she's written, perhaps I could say that she has a moderate appreciation of the French. It's a love-hate relationship, isn't it? It's disappointed love, says Denise Bombardier. Well, I'm sure you won't be disappointed, and I'm not going to take her speaking time away because she's going to moderate an exceptional round table, and I'm sure that I hope that at the end of this round table her love will be slightly less disappointed than it is as she starts. Denise, you have the floor. First of all, I've looked at the screen and I got the wrong glasses because I looked at myself on the screen and I feel like I look like Nana Mouskouri. That being said, if I didn't have my glasses on, I wouldn't see anything, and that would be a real shame for the beginning of this discussion. The subject for this evening: no politics without culture. Now, that sounds like a gag because it sounds like it's true, but the cocktail between politics and culture is pretty explosive, as we all know. One of the most explosive cocktails that exists, because the relations between politics and culture are complex, paradoxical, dangerous, and sometimes tremendously rewarding for both artists and politicians. But I have guests here who will, I'm sure, deal with this issue on the basis of their experience, their sensitivities, because they come from different parts of the world, different countries, different cultures, and let me introduce them to you straight away. First of all, Mr. Erik Orsenna, who is a writer, who is a member of the French Académie Française. Erik, I could talk about you for half an hour, but you're not the only one here. Erik Orsenna, of course, you know. Among other things, he was a cultural advisor to François Mitterrand when François Mitterrand was president of France. Then we have Mr. Chetan Bhagat, who is an Indian author, who is also a speaker. And Mr. Bhagat has written some very successful novels. His novels have remained bestsellers, and 3 of them have inspired Bollywood films. The Time magazine considers him as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. And Mr. Badr Jafar, who is the chairman and CEO of Crescent Enterprises in the United Arab Emirates. He is a defender of cultural diplomacy, and he has taken a number of initiatives in music, theater, and films to promote intercultural dialogue between the Arab world and other parts of the world. And he has been honored as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum. Mr. Jafar, please step up and join us. So I can now remove my glasses. Let's go straight into the subject, and I'm going to ask Monsieur Orsenna, first of all, to lead off.
Discuss and with the audience also.
Alors, je vais demander à Monsieur Orsenna.
Let me ask Mr. Orsenna to lead off, as I said. Can he start the ball rolling? Thank you very much, Madame Bombardier. I'm very happy. And as culture is a long-term thing, I'm happy to just take 5 minutes to introduce it. But 5 minutes will be enough. My conviction is that more than ever, we need culture. The world is moving from one universe to another. So the world is unstable. When you have a stable world, we need less culture. We saw that in literature in the 1960s. Everything was fine, and formalism was the watchword, and people could write novels they called new novels. But the need for culture is absolutely essential when the world is going through a metamorphosis. And we are going through a metamorphosis at the moment, because we have to understand more than we've ever understood before that the new world leads to violence, and if we don't understand that violence, then it will get out of hand. And what's very interesting is to try and find the places where culture is being produced today, and where culture is being presented and listened to today. Bilbao is the example we heard of earlier on, but I travel a lot in the world and in France, and everywhere cities like Avignon here are places which host cultural events, because people know and need culture, because they need culture for their pride. Metz used to be a military garrison. The New Beaubourg Museum was built in Metz, and people became proud of Metz once again. Marseille has got a new museum, and there is a real link between the changes in the world and new culture. And there is a dynamics going on here. I was in Hamburg the other day, and that is the same. And central states are becoming very depressed. Centralized states are on their way out. How come that the sum of their energy manages to lead to national depressions everywhere? And I think it's because the centralized states are no longer working properly. And my question about power is this. What about the centralized state? The centralized state has practically no power left, but pretends it does. It is making people more and more disappointed in democracy, more and more turning away from democracy, because the centralized state seems to have a lot of power, but the only power it has is to raise taxes these days. And therefore, what is the point of the centralized state today? Going further than that, and posing a more direct question, what is the point of a minister of culture in a state today? Is a minister of culture useful for anything? There is something which is essential: education, protecting heritage, determining the rules of the game between the market and the non-market, between the short term and the long term. That is the role of a ministry. But do we need these top-heavy administrations that have been created for other era, for other with other budgets and for other purposes? I chair the Center for the Sea in Rochefort, and we are producing a replica of Lafayette's ship. And in a city of 40,000 people, we host 400,000 people every year. And I have to consult the National Ministry of Culture to tell me that my subsidy has now been reduced from 6,700 euros to 6,400 euros. So my question is, the regional directorates for cultural action of the centralized ministries, are they worth anything? The great administrative structure of France is not only a bad thing because it costs too much, but the more structures you have, the less you know what each one of them does. It costs an awful lot, and it leads to a general system of powerlessness. So what I'm interested in is a vision, is a narrative. Let's look at the European level now. It is true that nation states, of course, are pretty down in the mouth, but Europe is the butt of jokes and anger by all of our citizens. For many years, there was talk of removing the Erasmus program. What would remain of Europe if we didn't have an Erasmus program? we would have continued to have two sorts of young people who can travel and young people who can't. Young people who can travel are interested in travel, opening their minds, culture, generosity, and the rest of it. And the other set of young people can't stand foreigners, whoever they are, because they never get out of their country. So my proposal is very simple. Instead of getting rid of Erasmus, we should multiply it by 3 or 4, first and foremost. But to give culture to politics, we must also impose Erasmus on our politicians. No politician should have a national mandate in their national countries without having spent at least a year in another country. That's my proposal. Well, that is in the heart of the matter. And you're going to put a few more nails in the coffin later on, aren't you? Yes, I've got plenty of nails. And I come from a society, from a company which is more metaphorical than real, Quebec, where culture doesn't get any more subsidies at all. And if we don't have culture, without our culture, only with politics, I wouldn't be here talking French, because it is the creators who contribute to the energy of the country, who've been able to express the views of the people. General de Gaulle was an artist too, and we appreciated him, but also our local creators, our local artists. General de Gaulle said one single sentence on a balcony, but it was better than many other sentences. But it still resonates in our ears, doesn't it? He didn't disappoint you, did he? No, he never disappointed us. No, he doesn't disappoint us. But I've had plenty of disappointments with France, but I've had plenty of disappointments with Quebec too. And I ended up by marrying an Englishman, the conqueror. Would you believe? But he's here. He's here. And he's a specialist of the French 18th century. And if he wasn't a specialist in France of the 18th century, we would never have met, you see? So culture leads to us meeting, leads to love. Now, I would now like...
Jafar, I have a question for you. How would you define culture nowadays?
Well, for me, and again, with a very sort of strong... Well, first of all, I'd like to apologize for speaking in English while being in France. It's very uncultured of me.
Thank you to apologize. We love that.
I heard. But no, for me, it's really what represents a people. And that can come in many shapes and forms, obviously, their music, their food, their language, but also the way in which they're educated, their language, but not necessarily the words themselves, but the way in which they express themselves. And so, yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, but it can go very deep, obviously. So if I may just give you some context about my perceptions from the Middle East perspective. And for most international observers, the Middle East is represented more by its problems and maybe misunderstood by its problems. Issues such as sectarian conflict, youth unemployment, women's rights, or the lack of it at times, and the list goes on. And I genuinely feel that's a huge shame, because that's in stark contrast to say how a region like Europe, for example, might be perceived. Many who have never set foot in France may have a deep understanding of this country from the people who are exposed to France's enormous, sort of cultural influence on the world. Again, people in America might have a love for Italy without even having visited the country, not necessarily because of their admiration, because of characters like Berlusconi, but more for their maybe love of Pavarotti, or even something simple such as enjoying pasta or pizza. And I think, of course, that theme applies as you go everywhere in the world. So people really have an intrinsic understanding of what these countries stand for from the perceptions they develop about their culture. And like I said, could be their food, their music, traditions, pastimes, sometimes even celebrities who represent a certain culture. And of course their brands, which is something extremely important, which I'll come to. So for me, culture is really the most powerful form of language. The most powerful form of communication, which can be understood and really cuts across borders as let's say more powerful than anything else, in my opinion. And again, it's a way for strangers to understand a society and gauge its values, and then perhaps empathize with its politics. And so again, as I said, at the best, it can be really an important bridge between two sometimes seemingly diametrically opposed societies. Now, again, going back to the Middle East, I think many of the cultural traits associated with the Middle East are placed in a negative context, like the sometimes, like the often misunderstanding, like the association between headscarves and women's rights, or and the more positive associations seem to be far and few between, and made things like falafel, which is very tasty, but I hope a region as rich in history as the Middle East can be known for more. So for me, again, like I said, it's a force that countries in the Middle East have been unable, in my opinion, to harness successfully yet. But again, to give you a couple of specific examples, if I may, if I have a couple more minutes left. So take the UAE, for example. And the UAE, which is the country where I'm from, is incredibly welcoming of other cultures, which is why I think they'll be a great host for something like the Expo 2020, which is coming up, and I thank France for its endorsement. The UAE legal system is obviously very heavily influenced by the French Civil Code. Our historic links to the UK are evident. But as much as the Arab world has been successful in embracing cultures from other parts of the world, historically and even more contemporarily, I think we haven't been successful at exporting many of our own wonderful brands, foods, music, and films. If you walk along any high street in the world, some of the major, centers of the world, in Paris or in London or New York or Shanghai, you'll be hard pressed to find a brand or an Arab brand. Or if you go in any sort of music shop, it'll be outside the Arab world. It's not easy to find that sort of music or indeed film. So I think this is something which has tremendous value. And for me, it's really about harnessing cultural diplomacy. So it's almost having culture lead perceptions, which ultimately will have inevitably an impact on the politics.
Don't you think that the expressions of culture can be threatened by the absence of freedom in societies?
The expressions of culture can be threatened. Well, in some ways, the expressions of culture are actually amplified. Because sometimes through a hardship of any nature, you can talk about human rights, you can talk about many other forms of hardship that exists. It can be socio-economic, it can be demographic, it can be socio-political, but that's sometimes the most fertile breeding ground for some of the most beautiful content of culture that develops. And this happens, and I think historically you've seen that in many different parts of the world. So there's also a way to look at it in a positive light.
Mr. Bhagat? I know that you have a presentation before talking to us. Yes.
Hi, I'm Chetan. I'm from India and I'm a writer. I write stories, so I thought I'll tell you a story about power and culture because I'm not as smart as some of the people here. So, it's better to get away, not even try. And I'm also sorry to speak in English. We had 250 years of British rule. So, unfortunately, Pondicherry is a much nicer place than the rest of India. But, you guys should have worked a little harder and occupied a little more. Please excuse me if I go over 1 or 2 minutes. But I wasn't a writer to begin with. I worked in Goldman Sachs and Deutsche Bank. I was in investment banking in Hong Kong and saw a lot of economies grow. And later I became a writer, and this topic is very close to my heart because this is what I do in my work. Wherever I used to go, including if I hang out with you guys, I'm sure over coffee, people say this, that what is wrong with India, right? Because we have very smart people. Indians are so smart, not me, but many of us. and we have a good language to integrate with the world. English, whatever you might say, it helps get through the door some places. And we have a lot of education, we have a legal system, everything, yet India is poor. And every economist here has written articles or read articles on India has so much potential. But we just have potential, we are not getting our act together. I don't want to show hundreds of figures, and this is probably the only graph I'll show here, but roughly even China is 4 times per capita than us. I'm not even comparing with European countries. So there is something wrong there, let's face it. Okay, so the popular narrative so far, and there is a lot of popular culture in India, Bollywood, things like that, is, I think this is the same everywhere. All that is wrong with the country is the fault of bad politicians, right? And that is a very, very common narrative in India. This picture is from a Bollywood movie. The guy looks evil, doesn't he? And this is still one of the more good-looking guys. The ugliest people are politicians in our movies. It's just that as if there is a species which is separate from humans, which is politicians, who come out there, rule us, and spoil it all for us. So it's somewhat wrong, obviously, and this is but what it has been. Indian politics so far has been on religion, class and caste. This is a very senior minister once told me that, Chetan, politics in India works on only these 3 things. When you want to ask for a vote on religion or on your class, rich or poor, or caste. We have a caste system which is very complicated. And also dynasty. Because I think, because that caste and class are important, we like it. Where do you come from? Who was your father? And therefore these things obviously have nothing to do with governance on how to make India increase its per capita income or things like that. But this is what has got people votes so far. We have 2 main parties, Congress and the BJP. Congress has been in power 60 out of 67 years. So they are obviously doing something right in terms of being in power. This is the 4th generation Gandhi family. Our first Prime Minister's daughter, first Prime Minister was Prime Minister for a long time. The daughter was a Prime Minister for a long time. The daughter's son was a Prime Minister for a long time. And the son's wife is Italian, as you know. She almost came to power. She decided to make her son the Prime Minister. It doesn't feel like a democracy, right? But it's working. 60 out of 67, you got to give them that. Because they get their thing, which a very common term in Indian politics is vote banks. Literally people who vote in blocks. Muslims, poor votes, caste-based votes, Congress gets it right. We might criticize them a lot back home, but they get it right again and again. The BJP is the more middle class. They're trying the Hindu majority thing. They're catching up. They're gaining traction now, but it's not worked as well. Well, all this is great, but what is the consequences? We have had monumental scams. I know there are corruption and everything in Europe, but you have no idea what we have. We have like $40 billion scams. I mean, seriously, the poorest country, one of the poorest countries in the world. And if you look at our scams, all our scams make it to the Forbes list. So, and there is a lot of poverty still, right? There's half of India's depending on where you draw the line, and there's a very poor governance. Now, this is something all that has been blamed on the bad politicians. But there have been some changes in the last few years, which has made people like me, the fact that people like me are read in wide numbers is a sign that something has changed. Of course, these Twitter, Facebook, media power, and there is a lot of frustration because ultimately, if you don't do a good job, there's a lot of youth out there which doesn't get what they are due in life. So this has led to movements for new anti-corruption law. You may have seen it in the pictures, like the Arab Spring. Not quite a revolution, but there was a lot of movements 2 years ago on people wanting new anti-corruption laws. There have been a few arrests. All 3 guys here are politicians. They're all in jail. But not a lot of them. Just a few of them. They were not politically very useful to the people in power. That was partly to do with why they were gone. But not much has changed. We still don't have those laws. The government did some lip service. A lot of freebie policies work during elections. Election year coming early next year. So literally somebody's proposed giving out 30 million mobile phones to people. And somebody's thinking of giving gold earrings to all the women. Literally, I'm not joking, I'm not making them up. These are the kind of policies that help people win vote. And there is no evidence yet in election results that we are actually looking for some different kind of government than what we have so far. What will truly change India? Now, for people like me, this is the real challenge. we have to change the culture. We have to change the culture because that changes the voting pattern, that changes the politics, and that leads to the true change. On the surface, you can shame a politician, but it will not really change anything if people don't really change within. And herein, I have to turn against my own audience, the audience that has given me this stage in India of millions and millions of people listening to me. I have to tell them something's wrong with you, buddy. And the real issue is bad us. It's not bad politicians. And this is a tough one because I don't want them to kick me out of the room because they don't like what I tell them. But they know that we all need this. We need a big, great Indian psychotherapy, which our artists need to do. So far, our artists have done song and dance numbers. All those will continue. But there are some real problems with the Indian psyche at the cost of stereotyping a little bit. There is civility. You know, some say it's because of the British, 250 years. They made us say yes sir a lot. I don't know if it's that. Some say it's our education system. Some say it's various ways, caste system, many reasons. But there is that tendency in us to take orders. We like taking orders. We don't like to lead so much. There is a numbness to injustice. Anybody who's visited India, you see poverty all around you and you see richness. You see it and you get used to it. The only way human body copes, that's not mine. Someone made it up? Okay, that's nice. So, oh, this is part of the presentation. Thank you. Okay, this is a live drawing. And divisiveness. We, like, you know, we are literally, I know you guys have your pride about who's from Paris and who's from Marseille and who's from Avignon, but you guys will not start fighting with each other over it to the point that, you know, there'll be some, he's like, don't be so sure. And we are very divisive in that way. It's very easy to cut ourselves because there was no India, you know. Before the British, there was like so many of little kingdoms. So the idea of India itself is, so these three things need to be fixed. My work, obviously, many of you are not familiar with my work here, but this film, 3 Idiots, you may have heard of. I tried to address these 3 exact issues: civility, in film about our education system, about 3 kids who rebel. Revolution 2020 was about a revolution, corruption, and I did a film on the Hindu-Muslim religious conflict on this. And these films all were well accepted. That means somewhere down the line, people are realizing, if told in a nice, interesting manner, that there is something within us which is wrong. If we don't change that, we'll keep throwing out bad politicians up at the top. And this is what's happening in India today. Does it work? The question is, does it work? The point is, these are very hard to measure things. But I'll just end with one evidence, and thank you for being so patient. You know, I tweet, everybody is tweeting these days. And one of the things that were literally the Congress proposed recently was, let's ban opinion polls, because they were losing in those opinion polls. So they said these are obviously wrong. So I gave this tweet, ban opinion polls, better ban opinions, or best ban polls, right? And it, this obviously was written by me, but next day, this is our Prime Minister candidate of the opposition party. He gave a blog and he took that tweet and put it in there, and just below that it's very hard to read that line where it says, friends, in that humor there's a profound message. Now these are our Prime Minister candidates who are now picking up on popular culture, and we are getting our own seat on the table to fix these guys a little bit, right? And it is great that this has started happening in India. It's still less, but ultimately when we change ourselves and the politicians think this change is coming, they will change themselves too. So yeah, it is true that no change without politics, but there's no politics without culture. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bhagat. And as I can see, you're not discouraged at all.
Huh?
You're not discouraged at all.
No. It is, of course, it's full of discouraged in what way, sorry? Discouraged by the politics of our country. It's very disheartening sometimes. Especially, you know, when you worked abroad, lived abroad for so long, like a place like Hong Kong, and then you come to India and see so much mismanagement, and people in power are, I mean, abusing it to, there's a little bit of abuse. I think India is okay with, we have this 7% rule. Nobody says anything to a politician if he takes 7%. But, you know, you can't take 37%, or you can't do no work. And
but it gives you more power as a writer.
Yeah, they are my muse.
Yes.
They are my muse, and I think it's a great time to be an artist in India if you are affected by these things. And I think the people of India are, their leadership is letting them down so much, and not just me, many popular figures have become, important voices, because the people who are supposed to be those people are not doing their job, and sometimes it has its downfall, because I am not supposed to behave like a politician, which is never a good thing, you know.
Erik, Orsenna, est-ce que si les artistes...
Erik, Orsenna, if artists and French artists and creators, if they were more vigilant and less complacent, would politicians be more shaken by them? Well, I don't know whether they are vigilant, but I'd like to say 2 or 3 things on what's just been said. What I think is interesting is that we have a new business line here, new jobs for young people, psychotherapy of people. Because you have a little job there, and I would imagine with the billions of Indians, the number of couches you need in India for all the Indians to be psychotherapied. So you'd have a business making couches there. So we need to develop that new business to teach politicians to change and to teach people to change as well. So psychotherapy would be very interesting. But what's very interesting to me is the question of democracy, because democracy is a real culture. And I remember having put a question to a Chinese minister. He said, didn't you think that there would be competition from the Indians? And he said, India is too complicated. And they lose far too much time building democracy, which is so complicated elsewhere. And in India, it'll take 1,000 years. So for 1,000 years, we've got no problems. That's what the Chinese minister said. So the question of democracy. And as democracy is a kind of a very fragile thing, there is a real question there. Let's go a bit further and talk about corruption. If you take one of the key moments of growth in France, nobody was more corrupt than Colbert under Louis XIV. Colbert didn't know the difference between his own wallet and the budget of the state. But it was a way of keeping French savings in the country. And if it was in other countries, like Africa, the African leaders pinched money from their countries and then came to live in Europe. But confidence is extremely difficult to build up, and you need something to trigger it. And it could be a writer or a few writers to trigger that confidence, or it could be growth. I'm absolutely fascinated and terrified by the situation in the Sahel that I work on at the moment. Mali and Niger are the only 2 countries in the world where there is no demographic transition. There are 6.7 to 6.8 children per woman. Other countries have managed fairly quickly to reduce the demographic pressure fairly quickly. And there's the example of Iran, which is another very interesting example. Because at one point, before international sanctions and all the rest of it in Iran, where there was the beginning of a real development, real economic growth, and what families thought, and even men dominating women, they said it's better to have fewer and better educated children than more children. And they said, we will perhaps have a better future if we have fewer, better educated children. So as soon as there is an opening, as soon as there is a possibility, the culture changes. And even in situations where women are completely dominated, suddenly they say, they find that there is a kind of respect for women. So you have a very complicated relationship between the economy, growth, culture, democracy, demography, and that weave is very different from country to country. And that's why when you're a writer like you and I are, and we try and look at reality, it's absolutely necessary today to have a very wide general education because the world is linked together. The world is a globalized world. But we must try and drive out the cliches, because what is good for one country is not good for another. So never sweeping statements, because there's no single recipe.
Yes, Mr. Jafar.
Yeah, no, I would absolutely agree. And I think this is some of the problems that we faced in the Middle East and North Africa, is where there has been this cookie-cutter approach to trying to solve certain issues, and some very deep entrenched issues, such as the certain recent campaigns for democracy, which have been failures, unfortunately, because I think the underlying, and again speaking as a businessman, the underlying issues was, and I think it would have been much more successful if instead they were drive towards simply rule of law. Because in relation-based economies such as in the Middle East, and I think partly to an extent like India as well, to switch to a rule-based economy overnight is not something that's difficult. It can cause a lot of disruption and indeed harm a lot more people than it will help. So,
in fact, you have too much money.
Well, you see, people tend to assume the Middle East is, or the Arab world is one, but I assure you we have plenty of poverty. But beyond that, what I'm trying to say is, with respect to the rule of law, and what's very important is, and again, related to the fact that we need to really encourage economic development. We have a demographic time bomb in the Arab world today. We have a huge, the largest youth unemployment in the world, and this is the biggest risk that we're facing, and the whole future of the region is at risk here. And again, it's not just about how the region might react internally, it's the impact that that might have to other parts of the world, including issues such as extremism and other forms. But just on the issue of corruption, again, I'd established something called the Pearl Initiative, which is trying to find the economic imperative towards establishing best practices and governance practices, and corruption is one of the biggest issues. And what we found is it is really indeed a cultural shift that's needed. But before you try and deal with that, you have any problem before you try and solve it, you first need to define it. And what we found when we were doing a number of surveys at the start is the concept of corruption varied widely as you went across the room. And this is not just an issue between East and West. Certain practices in America, say during the presidential campaign contributions that were raised, the $2-3 billion that would have been considered, say, in Europe or France, illegal, and could be jailed for certain practices of raising money there of that nature. So I think it's always finding, to pick up on your point, a culturally relevant and locally sensitive solution to these issues, and that I don't think is being done enough.
Sur ce point,
on that issue, we very often raise the question why Africa took so much time to develop. And one of the explanations, which I think is as good as any other, is that when you're an African, and I am familiar with West Africa, and you are successful, you're successful in your business ventures, you're appointed a minister. And as soon as you've been successful, you have your family, and it's your African family, in other words, 300 people who come and see you. And you distribute money to your family, and if you do that, you remain in the community, or you don't give them money and you're rejected from the community. And it's worse than death. It's a fate worse than death, a fate worse than, and you're considered dishonest for not giving money to your family. So there is a preference for the family rather than society. There is a preference for short-term rather than long-term and investment. And it's the inverse of Max Weber. It's the reverse of the Protestant work ethic. And there's a very interesting paradox there. We don't have enough social cohesion, but in other parts of the world there's too much social cohesion. It's very difficult to find the balance between the two.
Yeah. No, I agree with the points all of you made. Obviously, there is, on your first point, it always comes up. China says, and even many in India believe that, the democracy is what we're paying for. We're paying the big bill. But, and I think that's where all you people, all you influential people in Europe must realize we must never compromise on that. Because you can't use Facebook in China, and there are these basic things, the kind of stuff on opinion polls, the kind of tweets we do. Democracy is something which assumes that people are good and people are informed and well educated, and culturally they have to be culturally tuned to do the right democracy. But we can never give up democracy for sure. I mean, that'll be a bigger nightmare. Sometimes a benign dictator does a great job, but that doesn't justify dictatorship, I think. And so India will have to learn the slow way, and it's okay. It's okay I'd rather have my kids use Facebook tomorrow than have 10% better salary. And it's just an individual choice. But I think if in India those freedoms were taken away, I mean, it could lead to a very bad society. And I think eventually we'll catch up. I think we will get there, and I think there'll be more business to be done in India than in China. But I agree, there is no one solution. But what is happening in India often is that there are too many experts recommending better policies, better laws. This is, I think, one of the first discussions on, like, even where I've had to contribute on culture playing a role in corruption. Now you're saying that you have already seen work that culture plays a role, and there is no one, I agree, there is no one solution. It's going to be slow for a place like India, but sometimes we have too many people at the top who just recommend change this policy, open the economy, open this. No, it's not that simple. People have to want to change things. You have to tell people that there'll be a better tomorrow if you change this, and until they are on board, you can keep changing the laws. You could be the smartest guy up top. And I've seen bankers go and give presentations, and I have done those in the past, and with no idea of what's going on really in people's minds. And until people really want it, it's not going to happen.
Mais Erik Orsenna, comment vous expliquez que ce pays...
Erik Orsenna, how do you explain that a country which is a country of culture, which has been born by culture, by literature, born up by it, how come that this country, in terms of the culture budget, the cultural budget is far worse than it used to be, in a government which says that it defends the culture? It defends culture. In Quebec, it's the same thing. The global budget for the Ministry of Culture in Quebec is down. I was talking to the minister last week because I wanted to check the figures, and he said, no, it's not that. It's just that I haven't been increased, and if there hasn't been an increase, then it's been a decrease. So why is that situation in France? Yes, but what I was saying previously is this: could we not redefine the role of the Ministry of Culture? You don't need to have the Ministry of Culture of 50 years ago. The questions aren't the same. The cultural creation is not the same. You have internet, you have digital, and all the rest of it. So why do we still have to have an outdated structure? What strikes me in France is that we tend to consider that what we have experienced many, many years and centuries ago is still going on and will continue for the next few centuries. You know, we have eternity before us. And I would imagine that a minister of culture could say, let's start again. Let's have a clean slate. I want to do this, and I need so much to do this. I think that a Minister of Culture who would say that would defend his budget a lot better from the finance people than he does at the moment. So that's the first thing. Second thing, which I think is a real question, is this. You have a head of state in France who does everything and from what everything flows. Some of our heads of state thinks that culture is important. Some of them thinks that culture isn't important. I was the cultural advisor to François Mitterrand, and I'm very lucky to have been that, because François Mitterrand thought that to change people's lives, you had to change it through culture, and he put a lot of money into culture. And of course, he had a lot of money to give, but things were different then. But that's the way he felt anyway. A lot of people thought that François Mitterrand was too cultured. He knew too much about history and the history of Serbia. And because he knew a lot about Serbia, when Serbia and the ex-Yugoslavia exploded, he made the wrong decisions. But I think it's also true to say that our current president is not cultured enough. And I think a narrative is culture. Narrative is history. And a nation is not the sum of technical solutions. The nation is its culture. It's not just a question of algebra. It goes beyond that. There's a vision. There must be a vision. When you have a vision, you're prepared to have tactical retreats, to retreat here, to sacrifice things there. But you know where you're going. And it's not just a question of the budget of culture. If we had said, for instance, and we can still say it, for instance, France is a kind of huge Bilbao, and we're going to merge our energies and go forward like Bilbao has. Fine. Why? But why? To I think we have to overhaul the old world, as I said. The old world is over. And I really want to kick a lot of people's ass, I must say, in France, because my right foot is itching.
Point, because again, this is something which we're faced with. If you ask who holds the seat of culture, say, in the Arab world, and in particular where, say, the Gulf region, where the center of gravity has moved in the recent times, the government has been at the forefront of that movement and that development. But that's where I see a major risk, because it's not really sustainable. And this is where I think, again, speaking on behalf of the private sector, I think this is where the private sector has a phenomenal opportunity, really as a form of, you can call it social enterprise, but to get much more engaged in that cultural process, that cultural revolution. I mean, you take the US, for example, and one of the only countries in the world that doesn't have a cultural minister or a Ministry of Culture. But how successful has the US been at exporting? It's the largest music industry in the world, the largest film industry in the world by value, not the number of movies. And indeed, one of the largest fashion industries, unfortunately also very successful exporting food. But I think the issue is it's not just, and if we have an over-reliance on government, then I think that's a danger. And the danger, especially when you have the austerity, as we've seen in Europe in recent times, is the first thing to go. So I think, again, talking from my part of the world, it's really, and I know this is a bit of a cliche, but it really is a stakeholder engagement. You need not just the public sector, but I like to say it's sort of led by the private sector, enabled by the public sector, and ultimately for the people. And that's something which I think is a useful model.
Yes. What is the role of the private sector in culture in your country?
Well, I think the culture carriers or the culture keepers in a country have not realized their power yet. They were a lot like entertainers. You would not find, I'm giving popular examples, but like let's say someone like a Bono in the US or a George Clooney, they openly air their political views. It doesn't happen in India. There's a lot of fear of retribution, and anybody fairly popular will not say a word. A lot of movies are now, for example, the movie makers are all private, right? And and culture doesn't mean high culture, especially when it comes to politics. It's the pop culture which is going to affect. And the movie makers, very few now are realizing their true power of their work, because they're literally, they were entertainers. They were literally the people who entertain everybody, and they are not seeing themselves as, I think something very funny came up. I don't know. I think it was, I don't know. So I think the private sector is scared. The private sector...
Scared of what?
Of politics. They're very scared in India to do business. You cannot piss off the...
So, yes, of course, because they're linked with the power.
I mean, they sometimes...
And corruption is between politics and private sectors. That we know that.
Correct.
Also.
And so there is a lot of free press, there's a lot of everything, but at the same time, there is a fear, at least in the businesses, that they'll come after us. And it's very easy to come after companies, So it's, unfortunately, it's not there, but these ideas have to be first floated in India. People don't even realize that we have a role to play. The culture carriers feel that we are just, let's figure out how to make money, or let's, but once they realize, I think it'll be a huge thing, which is where we will gain much faster than China, I feel, once that culture of using culture comes in. It's not come in yet. And then once that happens, it can change things very, very fast. Whereas in a place like China, how do you change things? I mean, how? If you're not happy with something, how do you change it? Okay, they have a great economic growth, but where do you go to complain? Where do you go?
Oui, Erik.
Oui, moi je pense que...
Well, I think that there are missions of public good in culture, and that the private sector can't settle. The public sector has to settle who does what, the rules of the game. There's the question of copyright, Pierre Lescur's issue, and I don't know what his mission has led to. A minister asked him for a report and has not learnt any lessons from it. So he's made good recommendations and nobody applies them. So there are questions of the rules of the game. That's what the public sector has to do. The state, too, must guarantee the long term. The long term. must be the master of time, because the market is clearly something which has to be profitable, and therefore the market is in the short term. And the market, therefore, goes this way, that way, and the markets are not the master of time. There is a focus on the short term, and the markets are the hostage of the short time. The public sector has to educate, has to maintain the heritage in an old country like the country in Europe. So that's what the state has to do. And there's another thing which I think is very, very important, which is this. In every sector, particularly in the private sector, you have an obligation to evaluate. And in the public sector, in France, you have rules that you can't disobey, budgetary rules, but nobody evaluates anything. And there is a very French originality here. When you have a system that doesn't work, and everyone knows that it doesn't work, you don't evaluate it, you continue that system, and you criticize other people who have a better system than yours.
You have something to say?
Plenty to say.
Yes, well, say. You may.
No, I would agree. The only thing I would say is 2 points. One, just to answer with respect to engaging in politics, and I can fully empathize, I think, with you. But I think that there are very subtle ways, which are very powerful ways in which to do it, and it's simply through the art of storytelling. And I think when you can tell stories, especially ones that represent your culture, such a deep, long culture, such as India, such as one, of course, that exists also in parts of the Arab world, and to go, but a lot of the old stories have very modern themes. I mean, you just take, and something which I've done in a film company which I established was a lot of research, say, on the 11 different versions of the 1001 Arabian Nights. It's incredible when you look and you see how diverse those themes are and how so much of them relate to today. Why? Because it's all human stories. And humans haven't changed that much. Context has changed, but humans have not changed that much. So a historical way of doing it. And just to move to your point about the short-termism, I agree with you that business has suffered. I mean, or let's say societies have suffered because of businesses acting on short-termism. But I do genuinely believe that we have an opportunity today to embrace the culture of social enterprise, whereby people realize that unless you're in a casino, short-termism is not working, and the only way to build sustainable and scalable businesses, the idea being that it'll be profitable for longer, is if you make sure that the impact is not just on the bottom line, but they say the triple bottom line, the profit, but also the social, or the people, and the planet, or the environment, so the triple P. And I think that that's where you can have incredibly powerful social businesses that are focused on using culture as a form of diplomacy.
But Mr. Bhagat, if you may, I think the way you speak freely, you come here, you say exactly what you want, you're not politically correct, so you are the best of the Indian democracy. So in your country you can be a Democrat, you can be free, and there you are.
Yeah, and I'm not the only one. There are others.
I know you're not the only one.
But I think it's the newer generation who are native to the social media, who are native to certain technologies that have come in, and we know the pulse, and we can see I'm not the only one feeling it. And so we don't feel so alone, to be very frank with you. And linked to that, and I want to ask you this, because you're talking about the Middle East, and we have not discussed it at all when we talk of culture there. A big aspect of their culture is their religion, the Islam religion. And that's always something artists have had trouble with, especially when I talk about, of course, there have been cases of where they have, leave the extreme cases of art. But even things where certain reforms are required, certain interpretations, any religion can be interpreted in 20 different ways. If a little more modern approach is required, a liberal Islamism has not caught up. And like you said, maybe they shouldn't have asked for democracy, they should have asked for rule of law. One could even argue they could have maybe asked for a more liberal, or depends. Do you think that happening, or why haven't we seen a liberal Islamic movement, whereas so many people have been thinking the need for it? Do you think? What is your thoughts on that?
Look, religion is a very strong word, but what I would like to say is that I think there is a symbiotic relationship between faith and culture. And I think that applies anywhere around the world. Where it can be misinterpreted a lot of the times is, like I said at the beginning, is where sometimes culture is sometimes confused with some form of oppression. Such as, I use the UAE for example. Our women, especially the ones, who work in government and stuff, they wear the abaya. The abaya is the head cover, and they put that, and that's purely cultural. They're not doing that out of religious fervor. That is their dress. Just like in the Sari in India, where they cover their head, are they doing that because of fear of God? No, it's purely a cultural dress, but where that sometimes gets confused with oppression, and then it creates political, let's say, valleys between two nations. Is sometimes where I think it is danger. And you know what? It's nobody's fault but our own. What I mean by that is because that means that we have failed to communicate what it is that our culture is. Communicate either through music or through film or documentary or books. And so if there's a failure of understanding of culture, it's only our failure. And that's why I think there's a huge opportunity.
Erik?
On this issue of faith, obviously people have faith in God and a superior being and all the rest of it, but there's something else, which is confidence. What is confidence? It is common faith. It is the reference to a higher being. And we talked about pride earlier on. I've thought about the origin of the word pride. It comes from the Latin word ferus, and there is a savagery there. Pride is something which isn't always healthy. There's ferociousness there. You want to go beyond yourself. You want to do something special. And when you see a city which is proud of itself, people actually go beyond themselves. I participated in a project over the past couple of years of the construction of the A320 Airbus, and everyone who was involved in building that plane thought that they were building the best plane in the world. And the depression is thinking that you are worth less than you are. Pride is thinking that you're worth more than you are. And what we have to do in culture is to get people who think less of themselves to think more of themselves. And that is true of a city too, because I think states are too distant and they are not united enough. There is a question of space that the state has to leave people. And the right space, I think, is the city, is the metropolis. And the question is, a nation is not a sum of Singapores. And you can see that in France, where you have regional metropolises here, elsewhere in France, and you have cities of 30 to 40, 50,000 people who are trying to live together. And they're going to find it difficult because the metropolises are going to attract the best talents. So it's the question of the space. The right space is very, very important, because there is no common history if we don't know what we're talking about in terms of the reference space. And I was going to say, too, there can be no thriving cultural life if there is not the revolution that we must all live through, which is the cultural revolution, which is equality between men and women. And as long as we don't have equality between men and women, culture cannot thrive. Would you agree with that?
No, absolutely. I mean, look,
You agree with me.
You can't have.
You agree with me.
You cannot have a cultural revolution if you're ignoring 50% of your population.
Thank you.
That said, though, what I will say is you cannot have economic development without, you can't have rule of law with ignoring 50%. There is, again, though, like I would say, as I said before, sometimes a misunderstanding. I would say, and I would argue that, say, in some parts of the Middle East, including, say, in the Gulf today, policies are more progressive for women than they are in many parts of Europe. We have many situations. We have a law, for example, in the UAE, where every single public company has to have.
Tell you something? I think it's a joke. You're telling a joke.
No,
right
really,
now.
no, genuinely. No,
it's
genuinely.
impossible, because if women don't have the same rights, how can they do it?
I can give you some statistics. For example, we have a youth parliament in the UAE, 56% of which are girls. We have four.
Yes, but they don't have the same rights when they're born. So if they don't have the same rights as the boy,
according to
how
who?
can do? According to your law.
I think you should read the law. I mean,
well,
I've read it. But
it's in the
So, but like I said, you see,
all
this
the Islamic country, it's the same.
What I will say is, I think that's a generalization, but
it has to be generalized. Unfortunately, we would like exceptions, but we don't see them.
I'll go back to what I said before, and that is really that the reason that you are misinformed is our fault. The reason that there is that perception is only our fault. And I think, of course, there's tremendous injustice which goes on in many parts of the world, for not just related to this issue, but we have problems. But I think beyond, you see, it's human nature to fear what they don't understand.
That's why you fear women because you don't understand women. If you should understand women, you would be so happy to be very close.
No, it's okay. This is healthy. This is healthy. You see, if I didn't understand women, I wouldn't be smiling.
Donc, je pense que votre obligation, c'est
Your obligation is to invite Denise to your country as quickly as you possibly can. Okay, you have to invite Denise to your country so that she can see actually what goes on there. That's the answer.
Nouveau métier, c'est agent de voyage.
I have a new business, and that's being a travel agent. So, and don't cover your hair either.
He's not disagreeing with you. I think he's saying, attempts like Al Jazeera, which has been very successful. It's true that we don't know some of the things that are happening over there, and there's a certain perception and misconceptions. It's not just, it's many parts. We think Indians have elephants and snake charmers, and French people have wine and cheese all the time. That is actually true, actually. So, we try to do quick shortcuts in trying to stereotype people, and I think there's a lot of material for artists to really do this. The artists need to bridge these gaps and tell stories and tell songs and music, and I would say even Twitter, and Twitter is the new literature, and Facebook, all these things can tell the world that things are quite different, like the Iranian film industry, for example. It's there. So things are happening, and as long as people are working, trying their best, don't forget politics is a very powerful force. So it's very rare that culture becomes more powerful than politics. You're dealing with somebody who could prosecute you in regime. So it's very easy to pass judgment in a free nation about places which are not free. But when you're under oppression, free will goes out of the window. So,
Nous allons maintenant demander à la...
Now I'm going to ask if there are 3 questions from the audience. Just 3 questions, please. Yes, please, sir. Into a microphone, please.
Discussion. However, I feel saddened with 2 things. Every time I come to the Forum de Avignon, I find that most French people and a lot of European people equate culture and better culture with subsidy and state financing. Culture is not about that. Culture is a living organism. Culture is a sum total, a gestalt of beliefs, traditions, heritage, and the social change which has taken place over centuries. So culture can never be submerged. Please understand that the moment you start seeking patronage from the state to propagate your culture or to save your culture, you are treading on water. Why is it for 6 years I hear this constant cry from European artists and other cultural activists that there is a constant need for state intervention in the form of subsidy or the thing. It is not about what the gentleman said about developing new structures. That's a simplistic way of putting it. Who will create new structures? It's the people. And it's the culture which will then which will help people reform. All major reformations, all revolutions stem from people. And what do people are largely symbolized by? It is by their beliefs, by their tradition, by their heritage, by what they are entertained with, by what they are informed with. So it's important that we as artists and we as practitioners of culture understand our power, the power to subvert politics. Unless we believe that we can do it, we will constantly seek aid and feel disappointed. I think that should be a primary theme for Europe, that you do not need to seek constant subsidy. One of the reasons why India has the artisanal culture, the folk culture, the folk traditions have survived 5,000 years is because there is very little state subsidy. Because the state is more occupied with trying to look after people, as Chetan had pointed out, and it's culture which provides them hope. It's culture which provides them with ambition. It's culture which provides them with the tools of change. So let's all concentrate and debate how we can reform culture in a more contemporary manner so that it can be used for socio-economic change and not constantly bicker about, this city needs transformation. Please understand, when we talk of a country like India, you talk about metropolises. Please, we have a dozen cities which have population of more than 50 million people. A dozen cities with the population of more than 50 million people. They are the metropolises of the tomorrow, not 500,000 people. So please get your worldview in right perspective.
Mr. Orsenna will answer to you.
Monsieur, je suis...
Well, sir, I am upset about your anger, especially as your anger is about an opinion which I didn't offer. There have been... No, may I finish, please? There are ministers who could have been called ministers of propaganda, but that era is over, and Europe doesn't have the monopoly of ministers of propaganda. There have been ministers of propaganda everywhere. And I didn't say that culture could only live on subsidies. I simply said that there had to be rules of the game. And when you talk about the people, I am a little worried because the people is too much. That goes too far. And that leads to shortcuts, to false ideas. No, just let me finish. Don't get excited, sir. We'll have lunch together. We'll have dinner together. We're in Avignon. Don't get so excited about it. You're excited about subsidies, but I wasn't talking about subsidies. What I said was the role of the Minister of Culture, and here there is a Minister of Culture, and the role of public rules is that there are some areas which are not areas which should be in the market, because there are important costs, and yet those things have to have some role in a country. But I'm not advocating subsidies for everything. Far from it. Far from it. Whether we're talking about subsidies of large companies or subsidies from the public purse, basically, I really don't see who is doing more propaganda.
I think you misunderstood me. What I pointed was that the structure. If you talk about budgetary cuts and this culture, that's only one dimension. I'm not disputing your statement. I am just saying that we need to look beyond that. That is what I'm trying to say.
In fact, we all agree. Je vais donner maintenant la parole à Monsieur le Ministre de la Culture.
Let me give the floor to the Minister of Culture from South Africa.
Thank you very much, Program Director. I was initially told that I was going to speak in this session this evening, but in terms of the program, I'll speak tomorrow. I just want to make just a few points because the topic of culture and politics is something that is really, that's something that I pursue a lot. Firstly, to say that I agree with the speakers that, politics are influenced a lot by culture, because culture is about who we are as a people. It's about our way of life. And often in South Africa, when I speak about this topic, I always say culture is the soul of the nation. And therefore, it influences everything we do. But there's one other point I wanted to make that, politics can also be used to oppress people culturally. And that's where the danger is, because culture influences politics, so people use politics to, in fact, suppress people or force their own cultures on other people. If you look at a country like South Africa, under apartheid, black people in the main were subjugated in the name of culture. Their languages were oppressed, and their cultural expressions suppressed. So what we need to do, and this is my last point, what we need to do going forward is to ensure that we use culture to enhance democratic rule. I think that's one important thing that we must say, that we use culture as a weapon to foster human rights, and make sure that we use culture to strengthen relations between nation states, the whole issue of cultural diplomacy. So I think that's what we need to debate going forward, because there is power in culture. And how do we use this power to make the world better? And that's the point I wanted to make, but otherwise I will speak tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Alors, je crois que...
Well, I think that... There's another question here. Yes, please, sir. The last question, then. Last question. Because I think people want to move on, perhaps, to the gastronomic culture of the evening. Last question. I'm not going to talk about gastronomic culture, even though this is the place in the Palais of Pape where culture and gastronomy were linked for many centuries. Claudia Kassa, I'm a European Director of Radio and Television. What strikes me in the current era is that we are going through an unprecedented change in the world. I think the recent period for the more recent period, era, was 1480 to 1520, where the world shifted towards Europe. And now, in this new change, people are losing their cultural references. And therefore, we need, more than ever, an outlook, a sense of what brings us together. And people who are cultural carriers have that mission to bring us all together. Stefan Zweig talked about the world before in 1913, and what happened after that was the World War, and we must avoid that. But intellectuals, the trade unionists, the politicians, academics, and my generation all thought that they would cooperate, and they didn't. They knew everything and they did nothing, and we are in the same situation in Europe today. Everywhere there is the rise of populism. Everywhere intellectuals are saying we're in danger. Everywhere politicians are focusing on the need to react, and nobody is doing anything. Nobody is doing anything. And I think a forum like this, Cultural Forum, must be a forum of resurrection. Because if we don't have that sense of resurrection, if we don't think of our future together, over and above national borders, and in Europe, and in public television in particular in Europe, the politicians want national productions because they want to satisfy their national electorates. And that's a vicious circle, whereas the specificity of Europe is to have a common culture which goes beyond national frontiers. a European culture. And I think the issue for us today, people who carry culture, who are committed to culture, is to rethink what brings us together, what binds us together, and we must start by doing that on a European scale, because if we don't do that, we shall not be influential. And people who say that they are liberal, people who say that they are progressist, in India, in the Emirates, they need that because we are in a globalized world. And what we have to do today, therefore, is to realize that democracy lives in complex conditions. French democracy depends on German democracy. And that is a sum of very complicated interactions, politics, culture, but also individual responsibility. And what I'm concerned about today is that I don't think that anyone is really committed to thinking about that complexity in which there are so many difficult subjects, European-wide and worldwide. So that's the subject for me, and I'd like to know how each one of you thinks about that and is going to respond to that.
Alors, une minute.
Well, 1 minute for each one of you to conclude, please. 1 minute to conclude.
Mr. Jafar.
Mr. Jafar first.
I want to tell you something. Yes. When we were arguing,
I love you too.
Nothing was personal because I think you're a gentleman and a very moderate man, and you can explain things to me. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. No, unfortunately, some of the time the translation was being cut off, so I couldn't hear everything. But on that point, if I have 1 minute to summarize, generally on the conclusion, you know, somebody who I've had the pleasure and honor of working with recently in cultural endeavors is Quincy Jones, who's a famous music producer, and he gave me some advice many years ago that only actually really more recently started to really resonate. And he said, wherever you go in the world, first of all, you have to really go to know. That's critical. Even with the pace of technology today, you might get a taste, but you have to genuinely make an effort to go to absorb a culture. And when you are there, he gave 3 pieces of advice, which I just want to repeat. One is eat the food that they eat, listen to the music that they listen to, and try your best to learn at least 30 words from their language. And that will genuinely give you that snapshot into, as it were, their culture and be able to identify. And I invite you, Denise, to come. I know you haven't visited our part of the world yet, so I invite you to come and visit it.
What are the 30 words?
No, any 30 words.
Okay.
Any 30 words in a language, because through even the pronunciation, through the style, through the way, you get an insight into their culture.
Mr. Bhagat.
Okay, well, it has been a great experience to be here, not only because it's a great audience, but also, whatever the few of us in India are trying to do, we used to feel that nobody really cares about this, but to have such a big conference with the theme around this subject gives us a lot of effort, a lot of energy, a lot of inspiration to go back and work doubly hard to make this happen and use culture to subvert politics, someone said, and to really work in it. And culture is everywhere now, and the new technologies are allowing us. I don't know if you noticed, but if you could just have the tweets back on screen. I am guilty of tweeting in the middle of the session, but that's just the way the new generation likes it. If you can have the previous slide where you had the tweets coming in. If you missed it, but you may notice it when they flash the tweets now. So, and I've survived it, and I think it's great that all you guys think that way. Please help support us. Yeah, see the first one over there. So, so thank you so much. Thank you for making me listening to me.
How many followers are you? 1 minute. 2 million. Alors, quand même.
2 million followers. 2 million followers. You realize that?
No.
That's probably the number of Indians. It's probably the number of Indians born every day or something.
I'm jealous for that. I'm jealous for that.
C'est comme 200 chez vous.
Non, c'est quand même énorme.
No, but that's enormous. So I have great respect for you, Mr. Bhagat. Great respect. What am I learning? Apparently there's no more game. Stop tweeting.
Traduis pas ça là. Ça a l'air des femmes en plus. Ça a l'air d'une femme en bas là.
De la politique que j'aime.
There's a definition of politics which I love, which is the art of the possible. There's the possible, because you always compare the possible to the real, and you have to look at what is real and do what's possible. And then there's the culture. And if there's not a minimum of culture in that comparison between the possible and the real, then the real can't be changed. And then what is the role of a Minister of Culture? Is to make art possible. And that makes it possible for politics to have an influence on real life. So culture makes art possible. So I'm quite willing to audit the French Ministry of Culture, which I'm sure will be even less read than the tremendously good report of Mr. Pierre Lescure that I referred to earlier on.
Alors merci de votre attention.
Thank you very much for your attention. It was a pleasure to be your moderator.